General Rosa Martinez had not taken a real weekend off in over 8 months. The weight of commanding thousands of soldiers and making decisions that affected national security had become her daily reality. But today was different. Today, she was just Rosa, driving down a quiet country road in her brother's old pickup truck, heading to visit her mother in the small town of Millbrook. The truck's radio played soft country music as Rosa rolled down the windows, letting the fresh spring air fill the cab. She wore simple jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and sneakers. Her long black hair was pulled back in a ponytail instead of the tight military bun she usually wore. For the first time in months, she felt truly relaxed. Rosa had grown up in cities and military bases, so the peaceful countryside was a welcome change. Rolling hills stretched on both sides of the 2-lane highway, dotted with old farmhouses and grazing cattle. The stress of military life seemed to melt away with each mile she drove. Her mother, Elena, had moved to Millbrook 3 years ago to be closer to Rosa's aunt after her husband passed away. The town was small, maybe 5,000 people. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Rosa had only visited twice before, both times in full military uniform for brief holiday stops. She was looking forward to spending real time there, just being a daughter instead of a general. The GPS on her phone directed her through the main street of Millbrook. It was like stepping back in time. The buildings were mostly from the 1950s with wide sidewalks and old-fashioned streetlights. A few people walked along the sidewalks, moving at the slow, relaxed pace of small-town life. Rosa smiled, thinking about how different this was from the constant urgency of military bases. She pulled into her mother's driveway, a modest 2-story house with a white picket fence and flower beds full of roses. Before she could even turn off the engine, the front door flew open and Elena came rushing out, her face beaming with joy. "Mija!" Elena called out, using the Spanish term of endearment Rosa had heard all her life. "You made it!" Rosa climbed out of the truck and was immediately wrapped in her mother's warm embrace. Elena was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but her hugs had the power to make Rosa feel like a child again. The scent of her mother's perfume, the same one she had worn for 30 years, brought back a flood of childhood memories. "I'm so happy you're here," Elena said, stepping back to look at her daughter. "You look tired, Mija. You work too hard." Rosa laughed. "That's what weekends are for, Mom, to rest and spend time with family." They walked into the house together, Rosa carrying her small overnight bag. The interior was cozy and familiar, filled with family photos and the smell of Elena's cooking. On the mantelpiece were pictures of Rosa throughout her military career, from her early days as a young lieutenant to her recent promotion to general. Elena was incredibly proud of her daughter's achievements, though she often worried about the dangers and stress of military life. "Are you hungry?" Elena asked, the universal question of mothers everywhere. "I made your favorite chicken enchiladas." "Actually, I'm starving," Rosa admitted. "I skipped breakfast to get on the road early." They spent the next 2 hours in the kitchen, eating and talking about everything except work. Elena told stories about her neighbors, her garden, and the book club she had joined. Rosa shared funny stories from her personal life, carefully avoiding anything classified or too serious. It felt wonderful to have a normal conversation, to laugh without thinking about military strategy or national security. After lunch, they sat on the front porch swing watching the quiet street. A few neighbors walked by walking their dogs, and each one waved and smiled. It was the kind of peaceful afternoon Rosa rarely experienced in her high-pressure career. "This is nice," Rosa said, closing her eyes and feeling the warm sun on her face. "I forgot how quiet it could be." "You should visit more often," Elena said gently. "I know your job is important, but family is important too." Rosa opened her eyes and looked at her mother. "You're right. I've been so focused on work that I forgot to live a little." They talked until the late afternoon, sharing memories and making plans for the weekend. Rosa felt more relaxed than she had in months. The constant tension she carried in her shoulders was finally starting to ease. As the sun began to set, Elena stood up and stretched. "I need to start thinking about dinner, but first, would you mind running to the grocery store for me?" I forgot to buy milk and I want to make my famous tres leches cake for dessert tomorrow. Of course, Rosa said, happy to help. Where's the store? Just down Main Street, about 5 blocks. You can't miss it. It's the only grocery store in town. Elena handed her a $20 bill. Get some fresh bread too if they have any left. Rosa pocketed the money and grabbed the truck keys. I'll be back in 20 minutes. As she drove through town, Rosa noticed how different Millbrook looked in the early evening light. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, and a few teenagers were hanging out in the town square. It reminded her of movies she had seen about small American towns, the kind of place where life moved slowly and people took time to know each other. She found the grocery store easily, a small building with a neon sign that read, Miller's Market. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a few cars and an old bicycle chained to a lamppost. Rosa parked the truck and walked toward the entrance, enjoying the simple pleasure of a routine errand. Inside, the store was small, but well organized. The aisles were narrow and everything had that slightly worn look of a family business that had been operating for decades. An elderly man behind the counter nodded and smiled as she entered. Rosa smiled back, appreciating the friendly atmosphere. She found the milk in the dairy section and picked up a loaf of fresh bread from the bakery area. The bread was still warm, probably baked that afternoon. She also grabbed a small container of strawberries, thinking they would be perfect with the tres leches cake her mother planned to make. At the checkout counter, the elderly man rang up her purchases with the slow, careful movements of someone who was not in any hurry. "You're new in town," he said with a friendly smile. "I'm Frank Miller. My family owns this store." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Miller," Rosa replied. "I'm Rosa. I'm visiting my mother for the weekend." "That's wonderful. Family time is precious," Frank said as he bagged her groceries. "Your mother lives here in town?" "Yes, Elena Martinez. She moved here a few years ago." Frank's face lit up with recognition. "Oh, Elena, she's a sweetheart. Comes in here every Tuesday for her weekly shopping. Always has a kind word and asks about my grandchildren." He handed Rosa her change. "You tell her Frank says hello." "I will," Rosa promised, touched by the genuine warmth in the man's voice. This was exactly the kind of community spirit she had hoped to find in a small town. Rosa left the store feeling good about her mother's choice to live in Millbrook. It seemed like a place where people cared about each other, where neighbors were actually neighbors. She walked across the parking lot toward the truck, her mind already thinking about the quiet evening ahead with her mother. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. A few people were walking there, dogs along the sidewalk, and she could hear children playing in a nearby park. It was the picture of peaceful American small-town life. Rosa put the groceries in the truck and was about to get in when she heard raised voices coming from the other side of the parking lot. She looked over and saw 2 police officers standing near a young man who appeared to be in his late teens. Even from a distance, she could tell the situation was tense. Her military training kicked in automatically. Rosa had been taught to assess situations quickly, and something about this scene bothered her. The young man had his hands raised and was backing away from the officers, but they kept moving closer to him. Their body language was aggressive, not the calm professional demeanor she would expect from law enforcement. Rosa stood by her truck, watching carefully. The young man was clearly scared, and the officers seemed to be enjoying his fear. One of them was pointing at him and saying something that made his partner laugh. Rosa couldn't hear the exact words from where she stood, but their behavior struck her as unprofessional at best. She thought about getting in the truck and driving away. This wasn't her town, and it wasn't technically her business. She was supposed to be on vacation, taking a break from the responsibilities of command. But as she watched the scene unfold, Rosa realized she couldn't just walk away. Her sense of justice and her protective instincts were too strong. The young man stumbled backward, and one of the officers grabbed his arm roughly. Rosa made her decision. She closed the truck door and began walking toward them, her military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. She had no idea that this simple decision to help would change everything, not just for her, but for the entire town of Millbrook. As she approached, Rosa could see the fear in the young man's eyes and the cruel satisfaction in the officers' faces. She took a deep breath and prepared to do what she had always done throughout her military career: stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. She had no way of knowing that in the next few minutes, her quiet weekend in a small town would become a national news story that would be remembered for years to come. Rosa walked steadily toward the scene unfolding in the parking lot, her military training making her movements calm and purposeful. As she got closer, she could hear the officers' voices more clearly, and what she heard made her stomach turn. "Where do you think you're going, boy?" Officer Blake was saying, his voice dripping with contempt. He was a large man with a red face and small, mean eyes. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, and Rosa noticed his badge was crooked. "We're not done talking to you." The young man, who couldn't have been more than 17, kept his hands raised and his voice respectful. "Sir, I was just walking home from work. I haven't done anything wrong." "That's what they all say," Officer Morrison chimed in. He was thinner than his partner, but equally aggressive. "Turn around and put your hands on the car. We're going to search you." "But sir, what did I do?" the teenager asked, his voice shaking slightly. "I work at the hardware store. Mr. Peterson can tell you. I just got off my shift." Blake stepped closer, invading the young man's personal space. "Are you questioning us? Because that sounds like resisting arrest to me." Rosa had heard enough. She cleared her throat and stepped into their line of sight. "Excuse me, officers," she said in the calm, authoritative voice she had perfected over 25 years of military service. "Is there a problem here?" Both officers turned to look at her, their expressions immediately hostile. They saw a Latina woman in casual clothes who had the nerve to question their authority. Blake's face reddened even more. "Ma'am, this is police business," Blake said dismissively. "Move along." Rosa didn't move. Instead, she looked directly at the young man, who seemed surprised that someone was willing to intervene. "What's your name?" she asked him gently. "Diego," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Diego Hernandez. Diego, can you tell me what happened here?" Rosa asked, ignoring the officer's obvious irritation. "I was walking home from work when these officers stopped me," Diego explained, his words coming out in a rush. "They said I looked suspicious, but I haven't done anything. I work at Peterson's Hardware. I was just going home to help my mom with dinner." Rosa nodded and turned back to the officers. "What specific crime do you suspect this young man of committing?" Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting on his baton. "Lady, I told you this is none of your business. You need to leave now or we'll arrest you too." "On what charges?" Rosa asked calmly. "I'm exercising my right to observe a public interaction between law enforcement and a citizen. That's perfectly legal." Blake's patience was clearly running out. "You people always think you know better than the police," he said, the phrase "you people" loaded with obvious meaning. "This punk probably deals drugs or steals cars. That's what his kind does." Rosa felt a flash of anger at the blatant racism, but she kept her voice steady. "Have you found any evidence of illegal activity? Have you run his identification? Have you contacted his employer to verify his story?" "We don't need to justify our actions to you," Morrison snapped. "This is our town and we know how to handle troublemakers." "I'd like to see your badge numbers, please," Rosa said, pulling out her phone. "And your names." This request seemed to push Blake over the edge. "Oh, you're one of those, are you? Going to file a complaint? Going to call the ACLU?" He laughed bitterly. "Good luck with that, sweetheart. Nobody's going to care about your opinion." Diego looked between Rosa and the officers, clearly torn between gratitude for her help and fear that she was making things worse for both of them. "Ma'am, it's okay," he said quietly. "I don't want you to get in trouble because of me." Rosa looked at Diego and saw something that reminded her of her younger brother at that age. Innocent, hard-working, and afraid of a system that seemed stacked against him, her resolve strengthened. "Diego, you have rights," she said firmly. "These officers need probable cause to search you. They need a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Walking home from work is not a crime." Blake stepped toward Rosa, trying to intimidate her with his size. "Listen here, lady. You're interfering with a police investigation. That's a crime. If you don't leave right now, you're going to jail." Rosa stood her ground, her military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "What investigation? You haven't articulated any specific suspected crime. You haven't followed proper procedures, and your behavior toward this young man appears to be based on racial profiling, which is illegal." Morrison had heard enough. He moved to Rosa's side, clearly trying to flank her. That's it. You're under arrest for interfering with police business. That's not a real charge, officer, Rosa replied calmly. Perhaps you mean obstruction of justice, but that requires proof that I actually interfered with a legitimate law enforcement activity. Observing and asking questions is not interference. Blake's face was now bright red with rage. The fact that this woman knew the law and wasn't backing down was infuriating him. You think you're smart, don't you? Well, let me tell you something. This is our town and you're just another— He caught himself before saying the word, but everyone knew what he was thinking. The moment hung in the air, heavy with tension and the weight of generations of prejudice. Rosa looked directly into Blake's eyes. Another what, officer? Please finish your sentence. Several people had noticed the commotion and were beginning to gather at a safe distance. Some had their phones out, recording the interaction. Rosa was dimly aware of the growing audience, but her focus remained on protecting Diego and holding these officers accountable. Morrison noticed the phones too, and it made him even more aggressive. Put those phones away, he shouted at the bystanders. This is police business. But the people didn't move. If anything, more phones came out. Rosa realized that this situation was escalating beyond what she had intended, but she couldn't back down now. These officers were clearly abusing their power, and someone needed to stand up to them. Officers, Rosa said, trying one more time to de-escalate the situation. I suggest you let this young man go home to his family. There's no evidence of wrongdoing and you're creating a public disturbance. Blake laughed, but there was no humor in it. A public disturbance? Lady, you haven't seen anything yet. He turned to his partner. Morrison, arrest both of them. The kid for loitering and her for interfering with police business. You can't arrest someone for loitering when they're walking home from work, Rosa protested. And I haven't interfered with anything. I've simply observed and asked questions. Shut up, Blake shouted, spittle flying from his mouth. You think because you can speak fancy that you're better than us? You think your education makes you special? Well, it doesn't, not here. Morrison had moved behind Rosa now, and she could feel the situation spinning out of control. These officers were clearly not going to listen to reason, and their behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous. Diego stepped forward, his young face full of concern. Ma'am, please don't get arrested because of me. I'll do whatever they want. Rosa looked at him and saw the resignation in his eyes, the acceptance that this was just how things were for people like him in places like this. It broke her heart and strengthened her resolve at the same time. No, Diego, she said firmly. You don't have to accept this. Nobody should have to accept this. Blake had heard enough. That's it, he screamed. Cuff them both. As Morrison moved toward Rosa with handcuffs, she made a decision that would change everything. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small card, pressing it into Diego's hand while the officers were momentarily distracted by someone in the crowd calling out. If things get bad, she whispered quickly, call that number and tell them Rosa needs help. Tell them where we are. Diego looked down at the card in confusion, but before he could ask what it meant, Morrison grabbed Rosa's arm roughly. You're under arrest, he announced loudly, clearly playing to the crowd. You have the right to remain silent, though I doubt you'll use it. As Rosa felt the cold metal of the handcuffs clicking around her wrists, she wondered if she had just made a terrible mistake. But looking at Diego's frightened face and seeing the cruel satisfaction in the officer's eyes, she knew she had done the right thing. Sometimes standing up for justice meant accepting the consequences, even when those consequences were delivered by people who had forgotten what justice meant. The crowd of onlookers was growing larger, and Rosa could hear murmurs of disapproval at what they were witnessing. She hoped that their presence would prevent the situation from getting worse, but looking at the rage in Blake's eyes, she wasn't sure that anything could prevent what was about to happen. As they forced her toward their patrol car, Rosa held her head high, maintaining her dignity even in handcuffs. She had faced enemy fire and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. She could handle 2 small-town officers who had let power go to their heads. What she couldn't have predicted was just how far they were willing to go to humiliate someone they saw as a threat to their authority. The handcuffs were too tight, cutting into Rosa's wrists as officers Blake and Morrison roughly guided her toward their patrol car. She could hear Diego protesting behind her, his young voice cracking with emotion as he tried to tell anyone who would listen that she had only been trying to help him. Ma'am, you didn't do anything wrong, Diego called out. She was just asking questions. That's not illegal. Blake spun around, his face twisted with rage. Kid, if you don't shut up right now, you're going to spend the night in jail too. The crowd of onlookers had grown to about 20 people, a mix of teenagers, parents, and elderly residents who had been drawn by the commotion. Some were recording with their phones, while others whispered among themselves about what they were witnessing. Rosa could see the discomfort on many faces. This wasn't the kind of thing that usually happened in Millbrook. Morrison opened the back door of the patrol car and started to push Rosa inside. But Blake stopped him with a gesture. Wait, he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. I think our friend here needs to learn a lesson about respecting authority. Rosa looked up at him, maintaining her composure despite the growing sense that this situation was about to get much worse. Officer Blake, you're already looking at a lawsuit for false arrest. I strongly suggest you don't make this any worse for yourself. Blake's laugh was cold and cruel. A lawsuit? From who? You? He looked around at the crowd mockingly. Lady, you don't understand how things work in small towns. We are the law here. The mayor is my brother-in-law. The judge plays poker with my dad every Friday night. You think anyone's going to take your word over ours? Morrison nodded in agreement, emboldened by his partner's confidence. Blake's right. You outsiders come into our town thinking you can tell us how to do our jobs. Well, maybe it's time you learned that actions have consequences. Rosa felt a chill run down her spine as she recognized the look in their eyes. These weren't just corrupt cops having a bad day. These were men who felt completely untouchable, who believed they could do whatever they wanted without facing any consequences. She had seen that look before in war zones, in the eyes of people who had lost all connection to basic human decency. What are you planning to do? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. Blake's smile was pure malice. Well, since you seem to think you're so much better than everyone else, maybe you need a reminder of your place. He grabbed Rosa's arm and started pulling her away from the patrol car. Morrison followed, his hand resting on his baton. The crowd began to murmur more loudly, sensing that something truly disturbing was about to happen. Hey, called out an elderly woman from the crowd. That's enough. You arrested her. Now put her in the car and take her to the station. Blake turned toward the crowd, his voice booming across the parking lot. Anyone who interferes will be arrested too. This is official police business. But Rosa could see that his threat wasn't having the desired effect. Instead of dispersing, more people were gathering. Word was spreading through the small town that something serious was happening at Miller's Market. She could see teenagers texting frantically and adults making phone calls. Blake dragged Rosa across the parking lot toward the town square, where a massive oak tree stood in the center of a small, grassy area. The tree was old and gnarled, with thick branches that had provided shade for town picnics and gatherings for over a century. Rosa's heart sank as she realized what Blake intended to do. You can't be serious, she said, her calm finally beginning to crack. Oh, I'm dead serious, Blake replied. You want to act like you're in charge? Let's see how you feel when everyone in town sees you tied up like the troublemaker you are. Morrison produced a length of rope from somewhere. Rosa would later wonder if they had used this form of humiliation before. The thought that this might not be their first time doing something like this made her feel sick. This is assault, Rosa said loudly, making sure her voice carried to the crowd that was following them. This is kidnapping. This is a federal civil rights violation. You're destroying your careers and possibly your freedom. Blake pushed her back against the rough bark of the oak tree. Federal crime? He laughed. Lady, the feds don't care what happens in towns like this, especially to people like you. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, and Rosa could see the horror on their faces as they realized what was about to happen. Several people were shouting protests, but Blake and Morrison ignored them all. Please, said a middle-aged man who Rosa recognized as the hardware store owner Diego had mentioned. This has gone far enough. Just take her to the station and book her properly. Mr. Peterson, Blake called out, unless you want to join her, I suggest you shut up and mind your own business. Morrison had begun wrapping the rope around Rosa's waist, securing her to the tree. The bark was rough against her back and the rope was tight enough to restrict her breathing slightly. Rosa had been trained to endure physical discomfort, but the psychological impact of this public humiliation was something she had never prepared for. Look at her now, Blake announced to the crowd, his voice full of sadistic pleasure. Not so high and mighty anymore, is she? This is what happens when you don't know your place. Rosa forced herself to look out at the crowd, meeting their eyes instead of looking down in shame. She saw anger, discomfort, and sympathy on most faces, but she also saw fear. Fear of these officers, fear of what might happen to anyone who tried to help her. Blake wasn't finished. He stepped closer to Rosa, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "You people come into our town thinking you can change things, thinking you're better than us. Well, this is our town and these are our rules." The phrase "you people" hung in the air like a toxic cloud. There was no mistaking its meaning, no pretending that this was about anything other than racism and abuse of power. Morrison had finished tying the rope and stepped back to admire their work. "Perfect," he said with satisfaction. "Maybe now she'll think twice before sticking her nose where it doesn't belong." Rosa could feel the rough bark digging into her back through her shirt, and the rope was making it difficult to take deep breaths. But she refused to give these men the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she spoke clearly and calmly to the crowd. "My name is Rosa Martinez," she said, her voice carrying across the square. "I want everyone here to remember what happened today. I want you to remember that 2 police officers tied an unarmed woman to a tree for asking questions and trying to help a teenager. I want you to remember their faces and their names." Blake's face turned purple with rage. "Shut up," he screamed, raising his hand as if to strike her. But before he could make contact, a voice from the crowd called out, "I'm recording everything. The whole world is going to see this." Blake's hand stopped in midair as he realized that dozens of phones were pointed at him, capturing every moment of this encounter. In the age of social media, his actions weren't just being witnessed by the people of Millbrook, they were being broadcast to potentially millions of viewers. Morrison grabbed his partner's arm. "Blake, maybe we should..." "Should what?" Blake snarled. "These people need to learn respect. All of them." Rosa closed her eyes for a moment, drawing on her military training to center herself. She thought about all the soldiers she had commanded, all the young men and women who looked up to her for leadership and strength. She thought about Diego, who was probably terrified and confused. She thought about her mother, who would be worried when she didn't come home with the groceries, but mostly, she thought about the small card she had pressed into Diego's hand. On that card was a phone number that connected directly to her aide-de-camp at Fort Stevens, just 40 miles away. If Diego had the courage to make that call, if he could get through to Colonel Martinez, then this humiliation might not last much longer. Blake was speaking to the crowd again, his voice full of arrogance and hate. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. This is what happens when you disrespect the law in our town. This is what happens when you think you're better than the people who keep you safe." But Rosa could see that his words were having the opposite effect. Instead of cowing the crowd, his actions were galvanizing them. She could see anger building on faces throughout the square. People were making phone calls, sending texts, sharing videos. Blake thought he was demonstrating his power, but he was actually documenting his downfall. Diego had worked his way to the front of the crowd, tears streaming down his young face. "I'm sorry," he whispered to Rosa, though she was the only one who could hear him. "This is all my fault." Rosa managed to turn her head slightly to look at him. "No, Diego," she said softly. "This is not your fault. You did nothing wrong. Remember that." In his hand, she could see he was clutching the card she had given him. Their eyes met, and she nodded almost imperceptibly. Diego understood. He began backing away from the crowd, moving toward the edge of the square where he could make a phone call without being overheard. As Rosa watched Diego disappear into the gathering dusk, she allowed herself a small smile. Blake and Morrison thought they had won, thought they had taught her and the town a lesson about power and respect. They had no idea that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Diego's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and walked quickly away from the crowd gathered around the oak tree. His heart was pounding so hard he could barely think straight. The woman who had tried to help him was tied to a tree like some kind of criminal, and it was all because she had stood up for him. He looked down at the small white card Rosa had pressed into his palm. It was simple, with just a name and phone number printed in black ink. Colonel Martinez, emergency contact, 555-047. Diego didn't understand why a woman shopping for groceries would have a military emergency contact, but she had seemed so confident when she told him to call this number if things got bad. Things had definitely gotten bad. Diego found a spot behind Miller's Market where he couldn't be seen from the town square. His fingers trembled as he dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice, and then a crisp voice answered. Colonel Martinez speaking. Hello, sir, Diego said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was told to call this number. There's a woman named Rosa, and she said to tell you she needs help. She said to tell you where we are. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and when the colonel spoke again, his voice was sharp and urgent. Who is this? Where is General Martinez? What's happened? General? Diego's mind reeled. I don't know about any general, sir. There's a lady named Rosa Martinez, and the police have tied her to a tree in Millbrook. She was trying to help me, and they arrested both of us, but then they tied her up in the town square. Tied her to a tree? The colonel's voice rose in disbelief. Son, I need you to tell me exactly what happened, and I need you to tell me right now. Diego took a deep breath and began to explain everything that had occurred, from the initial confrontation in the parking lot to Rosa's current situation in the town square. As he spoke, he could hear the colonel typing rapidly on a keyboard and speaking to other people in the background. Diego, the colonel said when he finished his story, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The woman you're trying to help is General Rosa Martinez, one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army. She commands over 10,000 soldiers, and what those officers have done to her is not just illegal. It's an act against the United States military. Diego's legs felt weak. She's a general, but she was just shopping for groceries. Generals shop for groceries too, son, Colonel Martinez said, and Diego could hear grim humor in his voice despite the seriousness of the situation. Now I need you to stay on the line with me. Can you see the general from where you are? Diego crept back toward the edge of the square, staying hidden behind a building. Yes, sir, I can see her. She's still tied to the tree. There are a lot of people watching and everyone looks really upset. Good. The people watching might keep those officers from doing anything worse. I'm going to keep you on the phone and I want you to tell me immediately if anything changes. Can you do that? Yes, sir, Diego said, feeling slightly braver knowing that help was coming. While Diego kept watch, 40 miles away at Fort Stevens, Colonel James Martinez was setting in motion a response that would be talked about in military circles for years to come. As the general's aide-de-camp and second-in-command, he had access to resources that the officers in Millbrook couldn't even imagine. His first call was to the base commander, General Patricia Hayes, who authorized an immediate emergency response when she heard what had happened. His second call was to the military police commander, who began preparing a convoy within minutes. His third call was to the FBI field office, alerting them to a federal civil rights violation involving a high-ranking military officer. I want 2 Abrams tanks, 3 APCs, and a full platoon of soldiers rolling toward Millbrook in 15 minutes. Colonel Martinez barked into his radio. And I want the media alerted. If those local cops want to play games with the United States Army, then the whole world is going to watch them lose. But the colonel's most important call was to his contact at the Pentagon. Within minutes of that conversation, phones were ringing in Washington, D.C., alerting high-ranking officials that one of their generals was being unlawfully detained and humiliated by corrupt local police officers. Back in Millbrook, Rosa remained tied to the oak tree, maintaining her dignity despite the growing pain in her shoulders and back. The crowd around her had continued to grow, and she could see that word was spreading throughout the town. People were arriving on foot, in cars and on bicycles, drawn by social media posts and phone calls from friends and neighbors. Blake and Morrison seemed to be enjoying the attention. They stood near Rosa, occasionally making comments to the crowd about respecting authority and knowing one's place. But Rosa could see that their confidence was beginning to waver as they noticed how large and agitated the crowd was becoming. Maybe we should take her to the station now, Morrison suggested quietly to his partner. People are getting pretty worked up. Blake shook his head stubbornly. Let them get worked up. They need to see what happens when someone challenges us. Besides, what are they going to do? They're just a bunch of small-town nobodies. But Blake was wrong about the people of Millbrook. As Rosa watched the crowd, she could see that many of them were anything but nobodies. She recognized several people who clearly had military bearing, veterans who had settled in the peaceful town after their service. She could see business owners, teachers, and community leaders, all looking increasingly angry at what they were witnessing. An elderly man in a Vietnam War veteran's cap pushed through the crowd and approached Blake directly. "Officer, this has gone far enough," he said in a voice that carried the authority of someone who had commanded soldiers in combat. "Untie this woman and take her to the station properly, or there's going to be trouble," Blake sneered at the veteran. "Old man, you need to back off before you have a heart attack. This doesn't concern you. When police officers abuse their authority in my town, it concerns me," the veteran replied firmly. "I didn't fight for this country so that corrupt cops could tie innocent people to trees." Rosa felt a surge of gratitude toward the old soldier, but she was also worried that Blake's increasingly erratic behavior might lead him to arrest or assault the veteran as well. The situation was escalating beyond what anyone could control. That's when Diego's voice crackled through the phone he was still holding. "Sir, I can hear something rumbling in the distance. It sounds like heavy trucks or something." Colonel Martinez smiled grimly on the other end of the line. "That's not trucks, son. That's justice." The rumbling grew louder, and people in the crowd began looking around in confusion. The sound was deep and mechanical, unlike anything most of them had ever heard in their quiet town. Even Blake and Morrison stopped their taunting and looked around nervously. Then, in the distance, they could see lights approaching on the main highway that led into Millbrook. But these weren't the lights of cars or trucks. They were the massive headlights of military vehicles moving in formation. "What the hell?" Blake muttered, squinting into the darkness. The rumbling grew louder and louder until it seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. The crowd began to part and move back as they realized that whatever was coming was heading straight for the town square. Rosa, despite her pain and exhaustion, felt a surge of satisfaction as she recognized the sound. She had heard it countless times during her military career, the sound of M1 Abrams tanks on the move. The cavalry was coming, just as she had hoped it would. The first tank rolled into view, its massive bulk dwarfing the small buildings around the town square. Behind it came a second tank, followed by armored personnel carriers and Humvees filled with soldiers. The convoy moved with military precision, surrounding the square and positioning themselves with clear lines of sight to the oak tree where Rosa was tied. The crowd fell silent, awed by the massive display of military power that had suddenly descended on their small town. Blake and Morrison stood frozen in shock, their faces pale as they began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. As the vehicles came to a stop, their engines idling with a deep, powerful rumble, the doors of the lead Humvee opened. Colonel Martinez stepped out in full dress uniform, his face grim with barely controlled anger. Behind him came military police officers, FBI agents, and enough soldiers to handle any situation that might arise. Blake's voice cracked as he tried to speak. What is this? Who are you people?" Colonel Martinez walked directly to Rosa, his eyes taking in her situation with military efficiency. "General Martinez," he said formally, "are you injured?" Rosa managed a small smile despite everything she had endured. "I'm fine, Colonel. Just a little tied up at the moment." The colonel turned to face Blake and Morrison, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded soldiers in war zones around the world. "Officers, you are under arrest for the assault, kidnapping, and unlawful detention of a United States Army general. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use that right." Blake's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Morrison actually took a step backward, as if he could somehow escape the consequences of what they had done. As military police officers moved forward to cut Rosa's bonds and arrest Blake and Morrison, Diego emerged from his hiding place still holding the phone. The morning sun cast long shadows across the town square, as Rosa stood once again beneath the oak tree where she had been humiliated just 12 hours earlier. But everything was different now. The tree that had been a symbol of her degradation was now surrounded by news crews, federal investigators, and townspeople who looked at her with respect and admiration rather than pity. Colonel Martinez stood beside her, along with FBI Special Agent Patricia Wong and Deputy Attorney General David Chen, who had flown in from Washington overnight. The story had exploded across social media and news networks, with the hashtag #NAR General trending worldwide. "General Martinez," Agent Wong said, "we need to go over the events one more time for our federal investigation. I know it's difficult, but your testimony will be crucial for the civil rights charges we're filing." Rosa nodded, though her mind wasn't entirely focused on the legal proceedings. She kept thinking about Diego, who had shown incredible courage in making that phone call. She had already decided that his bravery deserved recognition, but she hadn't yet told him about the full scholarship to West Point that she was arranging. Blake and Morrison were currently sitting in federal custody, their bail denied due to the severity of the charges against them. The FBI had discovered that this wasn't their first incident of racial profiling and abuse of power. They had simply never encountered someone with the resources and connections to hold them accountable. Police Chief Robert Hayes had resigned in disgrace, and the mayor had called for a complete overhaul of the police department. 3 other officers had been suspended pending investigation, and the Department of Justice had announced a comprehensive review of law enforcement practices in Millbrook. As Rosa finished giving her statement to the FBI, she noticed a familiar figure approaching through the crowd. Elena Martinez, her mother, walked slowly toward her daughter, her face showing a mixture of pride, worry, and love. "Mija," Elena said softly, embracing Rosa tightly. "When I saw the news this morning, I couldn't believe it." "Are you really okay?" Rosa hugged her mother back, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. "I'm fine, Mom. I'm sorry you had to see it on the news instead of hearing it from me." First, Elena stepped back and looked at her daughter with the same expression she had worn when Rosa graduated from West Point 25 years earlier. "I raised you to stand up for what's right," she said firmly. "You did exactly what you should have done. I'm proud of you." Their reunion was interrupted by Diego, who approached hesitantly with his parents. He looked nervous but determined, and Rosa could see where he got his courage. Both his mother and father had the same steady, honest faces that suggested people of strong character. "General Martinez," Diego said formally, "my parents wanted to thank you for what you did, and I wanted to apologize again for getting you into this situation." Rosa smiled and extended her hand to Diego's parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Hernandez, you have an exceptional son. He showed real courage last night." Diego's mother, Carmen, wiped tears from her eyes. "When we heard what happened, what you did for our boy, we didn't know how to thank you." "There's no need to thank me," Rosa replied. "Any decent person would have done the same thing. But Diego, I do have something I want to discuss with you." She led the family to a quieter area away from the media and investigators. "Diego, I've been thinking about your future. You're obviously intelligent, brave, and you have strong moral character. Have you ever considered a military career?" Diego's eyes widened. "The military? I never really thought about it. I mean, I always planned to go to college, but my family doesn't have much money." Rosa smiled. "What if I told you that money wouldn't be a problem? What if I told you that there was a way for you to get the best education in the country, learn leadership skills, and serve your country at the same time?" Diego's father, Miguel, looked confused. "General, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to recommend Diego for admission to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Full scholarship, all expenses paid, and a guaranteed career as an officer in the U.S. Army upon graduation." The Hernandez family stood in stunned silence for a moment before Carmen burst into tears. Miguel put his arm around his son, his own eyes moist with emotion. "West Point?" Diego whispered. But people like me don't go to places like that." Rosa's expression became serious. "Diego, that kind of thinking is exactly what we're here to change. People like you, brave, intelligent, principled people, are exactly who should go to places like West Point. The military needs officers who understand what it means to stand up for others, who know what injustice looks like and are willing to fight against it." While the Hernandez family absorbed this life-changing news, Rosa noticed another group approaching. Frank Miller, the grocery store owner, led a delegation of about 20 townspeople, including the Vietnam veteran who had confronted Blake the night before. "General Martinez," Frank said, removing his hat respectfully, "we wanted to speak with you before you leave town." The Vietnam veteran, who introduced himself as Sergeant Major, retired William Thompson, stepped forward. "General, what happened to you last night was a disgrace to this town and to this country. But what you did, standing up for that young man despite the personal cost, that reminded us of what honor looks like." Frank nodded in agreement. "We've been talking among ourselves, and we realized that we let this happen by staying silent for too long. Blake and Morrison weren't good officers, and we all knew it, but we were afraid to speak up. What we want to know," said Mrs. Peterson from the hardware store, "is how we can make sure something like this never happens again." Rosa looked around at the faces of the townspeople. Honest, hard-working Americans who had been failed by their local government, but who were now ready to make changes. The first step is exactly what you're doing right now, she said. You're taking responsibility and asking the right questions. The second step is making sure that the new police chief and officers understand that they work for you, not the other way around. Sergeant Major Thompson nodded approvingly. We've already formed a Citizens Oversight Committee. We want to make sure the new department reflects the values of this community. That's excellent, Rosa replied. But remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It requires constant vigilance and the courage to speak up when you see something wrong. As the crowd began to disperse, Agent Wong approached Rosa with an update. General, I thought you'd like to know that Blake and Morrison have been formally charged with federal civil rights violations, kidnapping, assault under color of authority, and conspiracy to deprive civil rights. They're looking at serious prison time. Rosa nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction but not vindication. What about the police department? Complete federal oversight for the next 2 years, Agent Wong replied. New hiring practices, mandatory bias training, and civilian oversight. The mayor has agreed to all our conditions. As the official proceedings wound down, Rosa found herself once again standing with Diego beneath the oak tree. The media had moved on to interview other people, giving them a moment of relative privacy. General, Diego said quietly, can I ask you something? Of course. When you were tied to this tree last night, were you afraid? Rosa considered the question carefully. I was concerned about my safety, yes. But I wasn't afraid of those officers. Do you know why? Diego shook his head. Because I knew that their actions said everything about them and nothing about me. They thought they were humiliating me, but all they were really doing was revealing their own character. And I also knew that eventually justice would come. It might take time, but it would come. Diego looked up at the thick branches of the oak tree. Will you ever be able to look at this tree the same way again? Rosa smiled. I think I'll look at it differently, but not in a bad way. This tree witnessed something terrible last night, but it also witnessed something beautiful. A young man finding the courage to do the right thing, even when he was scared. A community coming together to demand better from their leaders. Justice arriving when it was needed most. She placed her hand on Diego's shoulder. This tree will always remind me that even in the darkest moments there are people willing to stand up for what's right. 6 months later, Rosa returned to Millbrook for 2 special occasions. The first was the graduation of the first class of the new Millbrook Police Academy, which had been completely rebuilt according to federal guidelines and best practices from around the country. The second was to see Diego off as he left for West Point. The town square had been transformed. The oak tree was now surrounded by a small memorial garden with a plaque that read, "In memory of all who have suffered injustice, and in honor of those who stand against it." The new police chief, an African-American woman with 20 years of experience in community policing, had made the memorial one of her first initiatives. Diego stood in his dress uniform, looking both nervous and excited about the journey ahead. His parents beamed with pride, and Rosa felt a deep satisfaction knowing that something good had come from that terrible night. Remember, she told Diego as they said their goodbyes, leadership isn't about commanding others. It's about serving others. It's about having the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult.